Sorry. So that startled me so much that I turned off the camera rather than pausing it. So this is going to be another one of those days where I have to send you more than one video. Sorry. Um, did you see me jump? Jeez, I didn't expect that. Okay. Where are we going now? Oh, the father speaks with an American accent, even though he's been in England for 30 years. If we flip over to page 8, we see that they are bantering. There's a languid conversation. They're not really saying much of anything. Well, we are two lame ducks. I don't think there is much difference. I am much obliged to you for calling me a duck. How is your tea? And this is a back and forth. Um, Next paragraph. Oh no, he's not clumsy, considering that he's an invalid himself. He's a very good nurse for a sick nurse. He's talking about his son. Down below, the last paragraph on page 8. Um, it's because his health is so poor, his father explained to Lord Warburton. It affects his mind and colors his way of looking at things. He seems to feel as if he had never had a chance. Doesn't that sound weirdly familiar? Minnie never had a chance. Alice died young too. But it's almost entirely theoretical, you know. It doesn't seem to affect his spirits. I can hardly ever see him when he wasn't cheerful, about as he is at present. He often cheers me up. Um, Over in the middle of page 9. When I was 20 years old, I was very highly developed indeed. I was working tooth and nail. You wouldn't be bored if you had something to do. But all you young men are too idle. You think too much of your pleasure. You are too fastidious and too indolent and too rich. That is, in fact, the lot of the aristocrats. We'll see a little bit later in Warburton, and this is foreshadowing it, that he questions the validity of such an existence. He represents a kind of new wave of thought. Uh, on page 10, there will be they will have a grim they will have to be grim jokes, said the old man. I am convinced there will be great changes, and not all for the better. um, Foreshadowing what's coming in Warburton's thought process. I agree with you, sir, Lord Warburton declared. I am very sure there will be great changes and that all sorts of queer things will happen, like industrialization and science. This was all um, bearing down on them. It was a period of the change in thought. You ought to take hold of a pretty woman, said his companion. He is trying hard to fall in love. But the old man says, the pretty women themselves may be sent flying, said Lord Warburton. He's not really in the market. That's what James is establishing for us. But the women will not be affected by the social and political changes because, like many women of the period, they just waited. Oh, like Warburton's sister. They're just kind of waiting around for somebody to swoop them up and marry them. At the top of page 11, it actually starts on the bottom of 10. As he said, however, he made a difference, and these words may have been intended as a confession of a personal error. His marriage, though of course it was not in place for either of his companions to remark that apparently the lady of his choice had not been one of the best. Mrs. Touchette, she's not very nice. Um, and they have a kind of a weird relationship. Remember that one of the underlying themes in this novel is the exploration of marriages, and the Touchette's marriage is decidedly distorted. She lives in Florence most of the year and comes home for a month to be, I don't know, to be in the company of her husband or something. My dear fellow, you can't see ideas, especially such ethereal ones as mine. Oh, I meant to read the next paragraph. Well, you may fall in love with whomever you please, but you must not fall in love with my niece, said the old man. Well, we know that the niece is on the horizon, and that is Isabel. If we look at the top of page 11, they are talking about her. Not behind your back. They're just hashing this out. Taken sister's girl. Oh, this is the telegram from Mrs. Touchette indicating that she's going to bring home the niece. Take it, sister's girl, died last year, go to Europe, two sisters, quite independent. That's Isabel. So you if you go back and read that very cryptic, um, what's this called? Telegram. I forgot the word. Um, we will learn what all of that means. But Isabel had two sisters, both of whom are married. So that's how it is that Mrs. Touchette can just gather up a girl. You just gather one up. Down at the bottom of page 11. She never telegraphs when you would expect it, only when you don't, said the man. She likes to drop on me suddenly. She thinks she will find me doing something wrong. She has never done so yet, but she is not discouraged. And kind of animosity between them. It is her independence, her son explained more favorably. Whatever that of those young ladies may be, her own is a match for it. She likes to do everything for herself. This is Mrs. Touchette, and it's perhaps why the she and Isabel get along well. At the top of page 13, just a note about Americans. I think you're too good because I shouldn't like her to marry you. She hasn't come here to look for a husband like many Americans. I hope. So many young ladies are doing that, coming to Europe to gather up a husband. But apparently, they think Isabel probably isn't. Next chapter begins with while this exchange of pleasantries took place between the two, Ralph, I'm going to have trouble with that the whole class. Ralph Touchette wandered away a little with his usual slouching gait, his hands in his pockets, and his little rowdyish terrier at his heels. Um, and then, now notice that Isabel does not appear in the first chapter. um, a person who had just made her appearance in the doorway of the dwelling for some moments before he perceived her. That's interesting because she's standing framed by the dwelling. And this is going to be one of the locations where we are going to learn something about her. And location becomes important because she's going to travel from one place to another. And in each one, we will explore how she responds to experiences. Down at the bottom, she's wearing a black dress because she's in mourning because of her father. Who is that strange woman? Mr. Touchette had asked. Perhaps it is Mrs. Touchette's niece, the independent young lady. Um, Pay attention. They are really quite taken with this idea. Top of page 15. I suppose the young lady has left her somewhere. It's a part of the independence. Well, Mrs. Touchette has the habit of arriving at the family home and then disappearing for a couple of hours. You wonder what she's, just fluffing up or what. Um, Next page, top of the page. She remained standing where they had met, making no offer to advance or to speak to Mr. Touchette. And while she lingered in the doorway, being framed, slim and charming, her interlocutor wondered whether she expected the old man to come and pay her his respects. American girls were used to a great deal of deference, and it had been intimated that this one had a high spirit. Um, Perhaps American manners are different, and I think that's something we already know. If you look at the top of page 17, Mrs. Touchette is being revealed a little bit. The top of the page. We can do better than that if we have notice. And the old man stood there, smiling, rubbing his hands, and slowly shaking his head at her. But Mrs. Touchette doesn't like receptions. Next couple paragraphs. She went straight to her room. Yes, and locked herself in. She always does that. Well, I suppose I shall see her next week. Isn't that odd? Down at the bottom of page 17, there's a big paragraph. She had been looking all around here. This is Isabel. At the lawn, the great trees, the reedy silvery Thames, the beautiful old house. And while engaged in this survey, she had also narrowly scrutinized her companions, a comprehensiveness of observation easily conceivable on the part of a young woman who was evidently both intelligent and excited. She had seated herself and had put away the little dog. Her white hands in her lap were folded upon her black dress. I swear you see this in novels that somebody who's nice to dogs is a nice person. And here she's kind of taken with this one. Um, it's one of those decorative dogs, like Wharton and me. Um, Her impressions were numerous, and they were all reflected in a clear, still smile. I've never seen anything so beautiful as this, she declared. Um, so Isabel's being revealed by her environment. We'll look at the top of page 19. Um, Isabel seems a little stunned to find herself where she is. At the top of 19, you are very kind. I hardly know. She's been asked if she's going to stay. My aunt must settle that. And a few lines later, I don't believe you allow things to be settled for you. Oh yes, if they are settled as I like them. That's hilarious. Um, James isn't really all that funny, but I think that's a really telling phrase. Um, and then again, a little window into Mrs. Touchette. It was because, and this is why the family has never known that there were even nieces, it was because there was some disagreement between your mother and my father after my mother's death, which took place when I was a child. In consequence of it, we never expected to see you. So that's how it is that Mrs. Touchette even discovered that there were nieces. Um, she says down at the bottom, again, noting her decision making properties. Bottom of 19. Oh no, she has not adopted me. I am not a candidate for adoption. Top of page 20. This requires a star. All those things that highlight her independence should be starred. I am very fond of my liberty. And then at the end of the chapter, you wished a while ago to see my idea of an interesting woman. This is Warbird. There it is. So that's his view of her. Next chapter. Some windows into Mrs. Touchette. Mrs. Touchette was certainly a person of many oddities. It was, although it was by no means without benevolence, rarely succeeded in giving an impression of softness. She does not have much softness in her. She says what she wants, she does what she wants, and um, she has an extreme respect for her own motives. So that, of course, we wonder what are her motives. We don't know yet. Page 22. She was not fond of England and had 3 or 4 reasons for it, to which she currently alluded. They bore upon minor points of British civilization, but for Mrs. Touchette, they amply justified non-resident. She detested bread sauce. I think that's pudding. In our sense of the word pudding, not theirs. Theirs is usually bread pudding. She objected to the consumption of beer by her maidservants. She affirmed that the British laundress was not a mistress of her art. So that's why she doesn't like England. It seems kind of petty. Next paragraph. She had taken up her niece. There was little doubt of that. One wet afternoon, some 4 months earlier than the occurrence lately narrated, this young lady had been seated alone with a book. To say that she had a book is to say that her solitude did not press upon her. That's another thematic that appears. Um, she reads quite a bit, but one of the references pretty soon is that she's reading German philosophers. Those are a little heavy, and she prefers to learn by experience. So if she's reading, many times it is. She's experiencing what is around her rather than what is in the book. Down at the bottom of page 23, Isabel, of course, knew nothing about bills. Oh, I thought that was fascinating. She doesn't know anything about what she's inherited, if anything. She doesn't know what the sale of the house back in Albany should bring up. Remember, we have seen this repeatedly that women were not to have experience in business. Vulgar. Page 24. The little girl had been offered the opportunity of laying a foundation of knowledge in this establishment, in other words, she was put in school, and that didn't last very long, and then she wasn't schooled at all. Next few lines later, now, here are these typical James paragraphs. They go on forever. She had uncontrolled use of a library full of books with front pieces, which she used to climb upon to take down. She chose the books because of the front pieces. I think that's kind of like choosing wine because of the labels. I mean, there's so many choices. You just have to pick one that looks nice. Um, Over on page 25, Isabel, however, oh, they called this room the office. I lost my place. Isabel, however, gave as little attention as possible to the incongruities of the season. She kept her eyes on her book and tried to fix her mind. Notice her mind is kind of wandering. Um, yeah, here's the reference to German. Just now she had given it marching orders, and it had been trudging over the sandy plains of a history of German thought. Over on page 26, in the middle of the page, or about a third of the way down, Isabel Isabel thought she had very strange manners. Now, this is the scene where Mrs. Touchette has discovered her. Well, she knew about her, and then she goes to acquire her. Um, they had called her crazy Aunt Lydia. She seems a little odd. Down at the bottom of the page, I think you must be, and in this way the aunt and the niece made friends. The aunt had quarreled years before with her brother in law after the death of her sister, taking him to task for the manner in which he brought up his three girls, their education or lack thereof. And in some ways that resembles James's own education, which was random, but that would be typical for girls. They didn't get much. Wait till we meet Warburton's sisters. There's two of them. At the top of 27, there was no need of writing, for she should attach no importance. This is she, meaning Mrs. Touchette. Uh, uh, for she should attach no importance to any account of them that she should elicit by letter. She believed always in seeing for one's self. Again, a little window into Mrs. Touchette, but in some ways similar to Isabel. Middle of page 27, um, another indicator about how women are not supposed to pay attention to business affairs. How much money do you expect to get for it? Mrs. Touchette says of the house. Uh, I, I haven't the least idea. It's the second time you have said that to me, her aunt says, and yet you don't look at all stupid. I'm not stupid, but I don't know anything about business. I just thought that was an interesting echo from previous readings. Top of page 28. Is that what you call being full of life? I mean, full of experience of people's feelings and sorrows, not of their sorrows only, for I have been very happy here as a child. And she's talking about the echoes that might be in that house in Albany. Middle of 28. Do everything you tell me? I don't think I can promise that. Again, asserting her independence. No, you don't look like a young lady of that sort. You are fond of your own way, but it's not for me to blame you, because she's an American, down at the bottom of the page. But her aunt infused a new vividness into the idea and gave her so many fresh impressions that it seemed to her she had overestimated the charms of conformity. Beginning to discover something about herself. Um, Page 29. But after this, she had asked a good many questions, and her aunt's answers, whatever they were, struck her as deeply interesting. So she's developing an admiration of Mrs. Touchette. And what we have discovered in this chapter about Isabel is that she is intelligent. Not she doesn't necessarily conform like her sisters did, because remember the sisters are married. Um, and she is interested in Europe, and she mentions the concept of freedom. In the next chapter is a description of Isabel's sister. They are conforming. They have marriages, but we know that there wasn't many opportunities for girls at the time. She was the Mrs. Ludlow was the eldest of the three. She usually thought more sensible. Edith a beauty, and Lillian was the practical one. And we see her they're examining or James is examining their various marriages. It's a contrast to the Touchettes, of course, but it's quite conforming. Top of page 31. Um, Well, I don't like originals, I like translations. Mr. Ludlow had more than once replied, Isabel is written in a foreign language, so she's different from her sisters. I can't make her out she ought to marry an Armenian or a Portuguese. Still trying to get her married off, but get her married off to a pretty foreign guy. Um, so they're talking about Isabel down at the bottom of page 30. She has offered to take her. She's dying to have Isabel go. But what I want her to do when she gets her there is to give her all the advantages. I am sure that all we have to do is to give her a chance to develop. And that's what we're going to watch. We're going to watch her develop. Next page, towards the bottom, in that big paragraph, she felt something had happened to her of which the importance was out of proportion to its appearance. There had really been a change in life. She gave value to any change. She had a desire to leave the past behind her and, as she said to herself, to begin afresh. And that's what she's doing. Her imagination in top of 31 was by habit ridiculously active. Again, fleshing out some details. In the middle of the paragraph 33, it appeared to Isabel that the disagreeable had been even too absent from her knowledge, for she had gathered from her acquaintance with literature that it was often a source of interest and even of instruction. Hardship. She's never even had any hardship. Top of the page 34, an echo of what we know from Henry James. They had had no regular education and no permanent home. He wished his daughters, even as children, to see as much of the world as possible. Of course, which had whetted our heroine's curiosity without enabling her to satisfy it. He was clever, superior, and he this is his clever, superior, and remarkable girl. Over on page 35. Um, she saw the young men who came in large numbers to see her sister, but as a general thing, they were afraid of her. Isabel. Her reputation of reading a great deal hung about her like a cloudy envelope um, of a goddess in an epic. The poor girl liked to be thought clever, but she hated to be thought bookish. Many of us were considered bookish. She had a great desire for knowledge, but she had preferred almost any source of information to the printed page. She had an immense curiosity about life. There's a reference below about the Civil War. While the Civil War went on, she was still a very young girl. So the Civil War, of course, went from 1861 to 1865, and she was little at the time. One thing that one critic notices is that there are pretty vague pointers about time. This is we know she was a little girl, but was she 5 or 6, or was it the beginning of the Civil War, the end of the Civil War? James does that on purpose. Um, there's a reference on page 36 to Caspar Goodwood. He's going to come back um, into the story. He's going to appear in Europe. He is her suitor at home. Um, he was the finest young man she had ever seen, was indeed quite a magnificent young man, and he filled her with a certain feeling of respect which she had never entertained for anyone else. But she doesn't really want to marry him. She is resisting that convention. He was not, however, a man to be discouraged by a defeat. So Casper's coming back. Page 38. So we're going to, let's see. Oh, let's see, who is this? I think the Mrs. appears. Ralph's rendered perfect justice to her affection, and knew that in her thoughts his turn always came after the care of her house and her conservatory. She was extremely fond of flowers. He found her completely dressed for dinner, because remember, he was summoned to her office, her area, um, to appear at 6:45. Um, at the top of page 39, we see that Ralph's father's background helps with Ralph. Um, this is what's appearing. No, I'm not playing that game. Um, But as he said to himself, he had no intention of turning Englishman. He's going to maintain his Americanisms. It had been for himself so very soluble a problem to live in England and yet not be of it. Henry James. He took pains to cultivate this spirit, however, to send the boy home for his education. Ralph spent several terms in an American school, which was Harvard, and took a degree at an American college, after which he struck his father on his return as even redundantly national. So, father and son, though they look alike, had different perspectives because Ralph Jr. is English. His outward conformity to the manners that surrounded him was nonetheless the mask of a mind that greatly enjoyed its independence. We look down at the bottom of the page. Uh, let's see, no, we don't need them. Top of page 40. He had made himself thoroughly comfortable in England, but he had never attempted to pitch his thoughts in the English key. I don't know if you can see that, but things appear on my screen and I have to get rid of them. Towards the bottom, he had to give up work and embrace the sorry occupation known as taking care of oneself. That's Ralph with consumption. Page 41. A certain fondness, a certain fund of indolence that he possessed came to his aid and helped to reconcile him to doing nothing. For at the best, he was too ill for anything but a passive life. We see that he does nothing, absolutely nothing all day. Of course, he's sick and coughing, but still, over on page 42, the truth was that he had simply accepted the situation of his illness. At the end of that larger paragraph on page 42, he speedily acquired a conviction, however, that he was not destined to fall in love with his cousin. So I think we saw it in some of, or maybe I haven't even told you this yet. The two of them, Isabel and Ralph, decide that it is not appropriate for cousins to marry. I'm just going to have to Isabel's beckoning me. I'll be right back. Okay, mission accomplished. Um, oh, and okay, I'm on page 42. Um, Ralph asks his mother, "What do you mean to do with her?" That is the question. At the top of 43, what do you mean to do with her? So, what we have on this page is Mrs. Touchette's view of Isabel. Do you see how carefully crafted this is? It's so brilliant to look at how it is, how the characters are defined by the observations and views of others. So it gives us a really full picture. I don't know whether she is a gifted being, but she is a clever girl with a strong will and a high temper. She has no idea of being bored. Interesting contrast to Ralph. Top of page 44. It is her general air of being someone in particular that strikes me. Who is this rare creature? Next paragraph, some contrasts of Americans versus Europeans. I thought she was meant for something better than to just sit in that crusty old office. It occurred to me that it would be a kindness to take her about and introduce her to the world. She thinks she knows a great deal of it, like most American girls. That's our point of view. But like most American girls, she is very much mistaken. I like to be well thought of, and for a woman of my age, there is no more becoming ornament than an attractive niece. Isn't that interesting? So, a picture into Mrs. Touchette's motivations. Something about how that reflects well on her for her to be taking in this this young girl who doesn't have apparently very many means. She spoke of her as you might speak of some young person of genius in want of encouragement and patronage. Again, the contrast to Europe. They all regard Europe over there as a sort of land of emigration, a refuge for their superfluous population. Uh, there was a little difficulty about the money question, and she seemed averse to being under pecuniary obligation. So she doesn't want to be in debt to anybody. And you sort of can't blame her. Um, Page 45, Mrs. Touchette's motivation again. Well, said Ralph, she will certainly do you credit, but won't she also give you trouble? Top of 46. Um, she herself will do everything she chooses. Reference to her independence. What do you mean then? What you mean then in your telegram was that her character was independent. We're on page 47, in the middle of this very lengthy paragraph. Um, she doesn't take suggestions. About halfway, or about a quarter of the way from the bottom. He lost nothing in truth by these wandering glances, for she was better worth looking at than most works of art. So she's pretty, she's smart, she has a high spirit, she's independent. Um, Her hair, which was dark even to blackness, had been an object of envy to many women. Her light gray eye, a little too keen perhaps, in her graver moments. Page 48, at the top. You apparently have a great passion for knowledge, her cousin answered. I think I have. Most girls seem to be so ignorant. You strike me as different from most girls. And then they talk about this ghost that's supposed to have, that supposedly dwells in the house. But the only people who can see it are people who have had hardship. Isabel hasn't had any. Um, at the top of page 49, I don't think I am. I have been told that I am not. I am said to be too theoretic. So she's in want of experience. About a third of the way down. I always know why, the girl said. It's because she doesn't expect one to like her. She doesn't care whether one does or not. That's Mrs. Touchette's. Their picture of her. Towards the bottom of 49, Ralph shook his head sadly. I might show it to you, but you would never see it, meaning the ghost. The privilege isn't given to everyone. It's not enviable. It has never been seen by a young, happy, innocent person like you. You must have suffered first, have suffered greatly, have gained some miserable knowledge. In that way, your eyes are opened to it. It's the concept of the fortunate fall. So just hold that thought about the ghost. It may or may not appear. Page 50 at the top. I am not afraid, she said, which seemed quite presumptuous enough. You are not afraid of suffering? Yes, I'm afraid of suffering, but I am not afraid of ghosts. And a few lines later, she continues, I don't think that's a fault. It's not absolutely necessary to suffer. We were not made for that. That's pretty innocent, pretty innocent. Next chapter, the first couple of lines. Isabel Archer was a young person of many theories. Her imagination was remarkably active. It had been her fortune to possess a finer mind than most of the persons among whom her lot was cast, like her sisters. Um, she, some her peers spoke of Isabel as a prodigy of learning, a young lady reputed to have read the classic authors in translation. At the top of page 52. It may be confirmed without delay that Isabel was probably very liable to the sin of self-esteem. Do we think she's arrogant? No, we don't think she's arrogant, but she does have a self-esteem which she intends to preserve. Impulsively, she often admired herself, but she does examine that self-admiration. A few lines later. In matters of opinion, she had her own way, and it had led her into 1,000 ridiculous zigzags. Every now and then she found out she was wrong, and then she treated herself to a week of passionate humility. Um, Towards the bottom of this big paragraph, the girl had a certain nobleness of imagination which rendered her a good many services and played her great many tricks. So again, echoing this idea that James is going to put her in many situations, and her responses to experience are what we are interested in. This is a picture of her interior on page 53. Sometimes She went so far as to wish that she should find herself some day in a difficult position, so that she might have the pleasure of being heroic as the occasion demanded. Um, Altogether, with her meager knowledge, her inflated ideals, her confidence at once innocent and dogmatic, her temper at once exacting and indulgent, her mixture of curiosity and fastidiousness, of vivacity and indifference, her desire to look well and to be, if possible, even better, her determination to see, to try, to know, her combination of delicate, desultory, frame-like spirit and the eager and personal young girl. Um, that is a description of her interior. Next paragraph. It was one of her theories that Isabel Archer was very fortunate in being independent and that she ought to make some very enlightened use of her independence. Um, then there's a description on page 54 about Henrietta. This is one of Isabel's friends. Henrietta is a radical, was a radical, and had a clear-cut views on most subjects. She's a journalist. And we see her at the beginning of chapter 9, I think. Down at the bottom, or a third of the way from the bottom, Henrietta for Isabel was chiefly a proof that a woman might suffice to herself and be happy. That's Henrietta's role, is to play that so that Isabel can see that she can be independent. At the bottom of page 54, the first on the list was a conviction that it was very vulgar to think too much about it. Marriage. From lapsing into a state of eagerness on this point, she earnestly prayed that she might be delivered. She held that a woman might be able to make up her life in singleness, and that it was perfectly possible to be happy without the society of a more or less coarse minded person of another sex. Uh, Henrietta is an interesting character. We'll get a bit more of her later, but now we see that Isabel has had the example of an independent woman. Few of the men she saw seemed worth an expenditure of imagination, and it made her smile to think that one of them should present himself as an incentive to hope and a reward for patience. Deep in her soul, it was the deepest thing there, lay a belief that a certain light should be drawn. She could give herself completely. A few lines later, she was planning her own development, desiring her own perfection, observing her own progress. Towards the bottom of page 55. What should one do with the misery of the world in a scheme of the agreeable? For oneself, it must be confessed that the question never held her long. She was too young, too impatient, too acquainted with pain. She always returned to her theory that a young woman whom, after all, everyone thought clever should begin by getting a general impression of life. This was necessary to prevent mistakes, and after it should be secured, she might make the unfortunate condition of others an object of special attention. Um, Down at the bottom of page 56, there's a reference to American Girls. Like the majority of American girls, Isabel had been encouraged to express herself. Her remarks had been attended to. She had been expected to have emotions and opinions. So that's quite a bit different from the European expectation, and that will be in the Mrs. Molyneux. That's Harcourt's sisters. Mid page 57, he wished to do something for her. He wished she would ask something of him. That's senior Mr. Touchette. He wants her to ask, he just wants to help. Down at the bottom, the books, he once said, well, I don't know much about the books. You must ask Ralph about it. I've always ascertained for myself. Get my information in the natural form. That's Mr. Touchette. Um, I never asked many questions. I just kept quiet and took notice. So he is an observer, but he clearly did well for himself because he became a very wealthy American in Europe. On page 58. Oh, let's see. Isabel talks about novels. You can see that her experience of suffering came from novels. I have no doubt they are good. Um, Isabel rejoined, but are they pleasant in society? They won't rob me nor beat me, but will they make themselves agreeable to me? That's what I like people to do. I don't hesitate to say so because I always appreciate it. I don't believe that they are very nice to girls. They are not nice to them in the novels. So she's pretty naive. At the top of 59 is it starts on 58. It was understood to be a description of my conversation, American peculiarities, nasal twang, Yankee notions, stars and stripes. Um, However, a few lines later, I have made them understand me pretty well. Um, but novels are not always accurate. That's right in the middle of the page. They are not always accurate. Towards the bottom of which is kind of ironic since James is writing a novel. At the bottom of the page, they have got everything pretty well fixed, Mr. Touchette admitted. It's all settled beforehand. That's the English way, and they don't leave it to the last moment. They aren't spontaneous. I don't like to have everything settled beforehand, said the girl. I like more unexpectedness. It's her willingness to take what happens to her. Page 60. I shall not have success if they are conventional. I am not in the least conventional. I am just the contrary. Um, they No, no, you are all wrong, said the old man. You can't tell what they will like. They are very inconsistent. That's their principal interest. Next chapter. The two amuse themselves time and again. This is Ralph and Isabel with talking the attitude of the British public. And is this chapter? Um, we're going to need to get a little insight um, into Burton later. All right, what else did I need to tell you? 62. Now, what is your point of view? She asked of her aunt. When you criticize everything here, you should have a point of view. Yours doesn't seem to be an American. Yours doesn't seem to be American. You thought everything over there was so disagreeable. When I criticize, I have mine. It's thoroughly American. That's pretty sassy to say to this rather crusty older lady. Um, and then, much to my delight, about a third of the way up from on page 62, she accused him of an odious want of seriousness. Those of you who have been in my classes before know that I really like that word odious. It just sounds funny and it's just such a good word. So she's accusing Ralph of not being serious enough. Over on page 63, um, it must be said that her wit was exercised to a large extent in self-defense, for her cousin amused himself by um, calling her Columbia and accusing her of a patriotism so fervent that it scorched. So Columbia, you saw that in the note. He's making fun of her for her Americanisms. Isabel's chief dread in life at this period of her development was that she would appear narrow-minded. Development again, often attributed to her towards the bottom of 63. In fact, the quality of this small, ripe country seemed as sweet to her as the taste of an October pear, and her satisfaction was at the root of the good spirits which enabled her to take her cousin's chaff and return it in good kind. Uh, she's really thriving in this new environment. Next page. Ralph is troubled at the bottom of page 64, but 64, yeah. Um, by the idea, by his puzzlement over who's going to go first between Mr. Touchette and Ralph. They're both ill. So he had been convinced that one, of course, that was the end game of their experience. And now here comes this bright light of a cousin, and he's a little bit worried about his previous train of thought. He wondered whether he were falling in love with the spontaneous young woman on page 65. Then he decided he was not. Lord Warburton had been right about her. She was a thoroughly interesting woman. If his cousin were to be nothing more than an entertainment to him, Ralph was conscious that she was an entertainment of high order. So these are all Ralph's thoughts, and we're getting pictures of these people. Um, he had had a life of illness for many years. At the top of page 66, she was an intelligent and she was intelligent and generous. It was a fine, free nature. But what was she going to do with herself? That's the third time that we have seen that question. Most women did with themselves nothing at all. This is the sisters. They waited in attitudes more or less gracefully passive for a man to come that way and furnish them with a destiny. Um, that's the quest for all these poor women. Isabel's originality was that she gave one an impression of having intentions of her own. At the top of page 67, Isabel, seeing him for a half an hour on the day of her arrival, she's talking about Warburton, had discovered in this brief space that she had liked him. He had made indeed a tolerably vivid impression on her mind, and she thought of him several times. But Warburton isn't just going to pose as the perfect Englishman. He has more depth than just being the object of a picture of a the perfect Englishman. She, down at the bottom, Isabel had spoken to him very often about specimens. Um, that is an interesting, she and Ralph talk about specimens. That's a word from science. And remember, this was a period of time when science was pushing out the old ways of thought, which had been dependent on God and religion. Over on page 69, towards the top, she prolonged her vigil for something less than an hour, and then rising, she said to Isabel that it was time they should go bid the gentleman good night. This incident is really telling. It contrasts the the English decorum versus the American surprise at it. And so, Isabel, you can't stay alone with the gentleman. You are not at Albany, my dear. And then on the next page, for himself, he was annoyed at his mother, though he thought she was right. I am not displeased, Isabel says at the top of the stairs, but I am surprised and a good deal puzzled. Was it not proper I should remain in the drawing room? She doesn't even get it. I'm not sure I would have let them stay in the drawing room either, if it were my teenage daughter. I forget how old she is. I shall always tell you, said her aunt, whenever I see you taking what seems to be too much liberty. Um, but pray do, but I don't say I shall always think your remonstrance just. Very likely not. You are too fond of your liberty. Yes, I think I'm very fond of it, but I always want to know the things one shouldn't do. So as to do them? Asked the aunt. And she says, so as to choose. Oh, golly, that's important. Um, what page are we on? Okay, we're doing pretty well. Page 50 to 51. This is back in Gora. Those words end a chapter, so as to choose, and there is a sense of drama in their placement. There's much more at stake in this conversation than bedtime. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. And that's Emerson. He writes in Self Reliance and adds that if you always scorn appearances, you always may. Isabel won't go as far as either Emerson suggests or Mrs. Touchett fears, but this new kind of young woman does want the freedom to determine the degree of her own conformity. She needs to know the limits of propriety, needs to know other people's rules in order to make her own. She reserves the right to shape her own life, and at this moment she more clearly resembles the ambitious young men of the 19th century novel than she does most other fictional members of her sex. Um, Henrietta Stackpole, the journalist, is a such an example. Um, Isabel sees her limitations. Henrietta has no sense of discretion and remains so closely in step with her public as never to go beyond the obvious. Nevertheless, she admires her energy and assurance. So there are problems with Henrietta, in which we will get to. She is a little inflexible. We'll just leave it at that. I have to come back to her in a minute. Um, wait, here, Henrietta. We'll come back to her. I have to write myself a note so I won't forget. All right, let's go back quick to the book. I'm trying to get to 88 because that's what I said. And if we get behind, it's going to be doomsday. So the next chapter 8 is about Lord Warburton. Burton. We now see him through other people's eyes. And it describes his sisters, it describes his brother, the vicar. Um, it's the Lord Burton is more liberal minded, more of that 19th century new man at the top of 72. Of all the American people in the world, and the Americans were the most grossly superstitious. They ranked with Tories, who are opposed to liberalism, and bigots, and every one of them. There were no conservatives like American conservatives. Um, Lord Warburton, boy, I'm going to struggle with that. From all of which Isabel gathered that Warburton was a nobleman of the newest pattern, a reformer, a radical, a contemner of ancient ways. He's questioning his very position. Down at the bottom of page 72. Lord Warburton imparted to his young American listener, taking pains to make things clear and to lay bare to her apprehension the peculiarities of English life. Isabel was often amused at his explicitness and at the small allowance he seemed to make either for her own experience or for her imagination. Um, in some ways, the current royal family in England is an extension of the questions that Warburton is posing. Is his position valid? Wealth. Um, I think so. He either has 6 or 8 homes, um, and he's just thinking about it. On the top of 75, let's see. He was so good as to say that America was the most charming country in the world, but his recollections of it appeared to encourage the idea that Americans in England would need to have a great many things explained to them. That is on the heels of her statement that she needs to be able to choose, but in order to be able to choose, she has to know the proprieties. There was no mistake, at least, about his being very intelligent and cultivated and knowing almost everything in the world. Although he said the most interesting and entertaining things, Isabel perceived that he never said them to exhibit himself, and though he had a great fortune, he was as far as possible from making a merit of it. We need to know that because he's not arrogant, he's not condescending. Um, we like him. His composition was a mixture of good humored manly force and a modesty that at all times was almost boyish, the sweet and wholesome savor of which lost nothing from the addition of a tone of kindness, a good deal of reflection, and conscience. Put a star in that because that really does illustrate Warburton. Page 74. Um, Middle, it's about a third of the way down. Great responsibilities, great opportunities, great consideration, great wealth, great power, a natural share in the public affairs of a country. He's got a seat in Parliament, but he is all in a muddle about himself, his position, his power, and everything. He is the victim of a critical age. Um, Over on page 75. Oh no, I don't need that. Page 76 at the top. Well, I mean, Lord Warburton and his friends, the radicals of the upper class. But Interestingly, they have the ability to be radicals of the upper class because they have so much. They talk about changes, but I don't think they quite realize. You and I, we know what it is to have lived under democratic institutions. That's the Americans. And remember, well, you all know this. We rejected um, monarchy. Um, Towards the bottom of page 76, you see that they are very luxurious, and these progressive ideas are about their biggest luxury, which is their wealth. At the top of page 77, Touchette says Lord Warburton is a very amiable young man, a very fine young man. He has 100,000 a year. Wow. He owns 50,000 acres of the soil in this little island. He has half a dozen houses to live in. He has a seat in Parliament, as I have one, at my own dinner table. He's very cultivated taste, cares for literature, for art, for science, for charming young ladies. The most cultivated is his taste for new views. This is, we hadn't seen this of Warburton before, that he is thinking and towards the end of that paragraph. And if there were to be a revolution, he would come off very easily. They wouldn't touch him. And he says he will never be a martyr unless you make him one. She says, you will never be one, I hope. Oh, I shall never make anyone a martyr. So what we see on the horizon, the changes is industrialization, science, and democratization. Next chapter. Here's the sisters Molyneux. It is true that when she spoke of them to her cousin as original, he declared that no epithet could be less applicable to these two young Miss Molyneux, for that there were 50,000 young women in England who exactly resembled them. Over on 79, I can't help it, Elizabeth says, I think it's lovely to be so quiet and reasonable and satisfied. She likes them. I should like to be like that. Heaven forbid, says Ralph. Um, she wants to go. She's invited to go to that um, to the Warburtons. What I forget. Oh, Lockley, to their um, to their home. However, when Ralph and his mother, with Ralph and his mother, she drove over to Lockley, so the decorum is still in place. Page 80. Right in the middle of the page. I'm afraid he is an imposter, exclaimed Isabel. Don't you think it's a false position? She's kind of taking up this questioning, this new idea. She can because she's an American. I suspect you think me very irreverent, Isabel took occasion to observe. I suppose you revere your brother and are rather afraid of him. They do, in fact, revere their brother. So the vicar comes over. This is the brother. And she observes of him, Isabel liked him. She was in the mood for liking everything, but her imagination was a good deal taxed to think of him as a source of spiritual aid. Not really religious. Over on the next page, top of 82, there is no want of inducements, Isabel answered, but I am afraid I can't make engagements. I am quite in my aunt's hands. Excuse me if I say I don't exactly believe that. I'm pretty sure you can do whatever you want. So she's willing to maintain the decorum for now. We're going to see what she does with this. Towards the bottom of 82, no, I am not easily charmed. And then he stopped a moment. But you have charmed me, Miss Archer. Warburton likes her. At the top of 83, yes, that's exactly what you enjoy most. I can't make out what you are up to, said Lord Warburton. You strike me as having mysterious purposes, vast designs. That's star-worthy because he is aware of her interior in a way that later in the novel we will see that other people are not. I'm not going to give away the story, but he's aware of her. He seems almost ideal. Next page. So let's see. Well, I just want to conclude this paragraph or this chapter. We are in unfolding Warburton. We are presented with someone who is um, aware of her interior and not somebody who will attempt to mold her. Chapter 10. Then we see Henrietta. It's just so clever how this is put together. She's the journalist. Perhaps even you have married a lord. That, and this is on the heels of the discovery in the last chapter that Warburton is pretty appealing. She writes a letter to Isabel, trying to meet up. She is, though she is a literary lady, I suppose that being an American, she won't reproduce me as the other one did. She has seen others like me. So this is Henrietta, who's of her own being. At the top, she travels alone. Can you imagine that? She has seen no other so delightful, Isabel answered, but she was not altogether at ease about Henrietta's reproductive instincts, which belonged to that side of her friend's character which she regarded as at least complacency. There's some hints here that Henrietta's coming over here to write about English people, and she's got her eye on Ralph and his father. But Isabel is a little worried about her ability to reproduce them accurately. Um, whichever you do will matter very little to her, said Isabel. She doesn't care a straw what men think about her. She intends to write about them. At the top of 87, the train arrived with Miss Stackpole. The most striking point in her appearance was the remarkable fixedness of this organ, her eye. Edgar Allan Poe, but as if in conscientious exercise of a natural right upon every object it happened to encounter. So she's got an eye for detail, which of course has created this journalism for her. Well, I should like to know whether you consider yourselves American or English, she says to the Touchettes. If once I knew, I could talk to you accordingly. So there's a little one-sidedness about her. He is what is called cosmopolitan, says Isabel. Next pair or towards the bottom. In spite of that, I felt cramped. I felt something pressing upon me. I couldn't tell what it was. I felt at the very commencement as if I were not going to sympathize with the atmosphere. She's kind of oppressed by the Englishness. She's used to being free. And then coming here to England, it's a little oppressive. Isabel speedily found occasion to request her to desist from celebrating the charms of their common sojourn in print. In other words, don't write about the Touchettes. She was going to write something called Americans and Tudors, Glimpses of Garden Court. Miss Stackpole, with the best conscience in the world, offered to read her the letter to Isabel, who immediately put in her protest. I don't think you ought to do that. I don't think you ought to describe the place, fearing that she wouldn't get it right. So we are going to stop there on page 89. I lost track of whether or not I went over the time because I had to stop it. So notice in your email about the class there are going to be two emails. Two links just because I stopped it when my dog Daphne startled me. So anyway, feel free to ask me questions or make points, and I will see you next week. Have a good week.